what we measure lags what we need. The balance sheet, I think, is a wonderful example of that. If you look at the balance sheet, what we define as assets, they're often not the assets that will equip us to change, to adapt. Many things that will be critical in this new economy, the creative economy we talked about, are not present. The one I'd love to touch on today, and I think we've just touched on wonderfully, is creativity. Now, the good news, and addressing this last issue, we're all born creative. I really believe that. But perhaps the conditions actually chip away at that creativity over time. We've talked a lot about the financial crisis. It's critical for all of us to understand, but it has some interesting and profound effects on what we all want. And I think this need to be creative is one of the things that we're seeking for more than ever before. And as an absolutely horrific piece of analysis on this, it's so flawed, it's unbelievable. I often use Google Trends. And this trend line you see here is just people searching for the word make. It's interesting to me how much it increased around the time of the financial crisis. Maybe that's partly necessity. I think that's almost certainly true. But it's also because we're looking for other ways to meet our needs, our creative needs. Technology is taking the friction out of being creative like never before. We live in a time where we basically are carrying supercomputers, and we're using that stuff to meet this need of being creative, whether it's me being creative around short prose on Twitter or being creative with imagery on Instagram. So technology is taking the friction out of being creative. The interesting question then comes to me is how can companies start to harness this latent creativity? And our creativity will define that future. So I'd love to now take you through some ways that I think companies are harnessing this latent creativity. The first one, and perhaps the easiest one, is they're starting to understand that consumers are creative. When you have a consumer and you design a very fancy hands-free kit, probably you'll get out-innovated by the consumer. They'll find a smarter way to do it. Or alternatively, consumers, innovators, creators will see the assets out in the world. They'll see the ones that are wasting, cars that are only used half an hour a day, and they'll design businesses. They'll be creative around the business model using technology in ways that will disrupt that traditional industry. An incredible example from the University of Washington is Fold It, where they ask game players, it's a multi-person game players to understand how proteins fold. They ran a challenge on there around AIDS research, and they solved a problem in 3 weeks that they'd wrestled with for a decade. But what's interesting to me is it doesn't just need to be outsourced. If you are outsourcing this creativity, how can you make sure that you're also building your own creative assets internally? This was just a couple of weeks ago. Avis bought Zipcar. Maybe they're acquiring creative talent in that way. If you're actually working on projects externally, can you inboard some of that knowledge to build the muscles? Or alternatively, Google's 20% time, which we've all seen. So Marissa Mayer, a fellow YGL, has referenced the fact that probably up to 50% of Google's products come from 20% time. The idea that their employees can spend a day a week doing pretty much whatever they want. It's terrifying. But some of the products that you can see up here came from that 20% time. Or hackathons. Can you organize hackathons, a rising movement? We, every quarter, run a makeathon, which we think of as almost an inclusive hackathon. We're terrified that hackathons are just developers. How can you invite more diverse people? In this case, in 24 hours, the team designed a bike light, a safety light that actually told you when people got up too close and gave a frowny face. And the final one is creating online communities. We, with Open Idea, have listened to how people are using the platform. We've started having communities take their own versions of the platform. And it's inspiring to see how the ideas, the insight that these organizations gather never come from where they expect. So my challenge for you, and my question ongoing, is when you see these little creative acts in your organization, people scratching this creative need, don't reject it. They're building a muscle. Think instead, how can these people actually fulfill their creative needs at work and combine together to move you in the direction of your purpose for your business?